My mother said she wanted to do something simple for my birthday. Just dinner. Just family. Nothing dramatic. I was turning 28, and after years of strained conversations and careful distance, I told myself not to expect anything more than a meal and a few polite smiles. I prepared for the usual comments dressed up as concern. I reminded myself that I could sit through an hour, maybe two, and then go home. The restaurant was louder than I expected. Too bright. Too crowded. Everyone was already seated when I arrived, as if the evening had started without me. My mother looked up first. She smiled the way she always did when she believed she had arranged everything exactly as planned. Dinner moved in fragments, laughter that came too quickly. Stories I had heard before, told louder this time. Little pauses where someone waited to see how I would react. I kept my answers short. I watched the condensation slide down my glass. I counted the minutes. Then the server appeared with a cake. Pink frosting, candles already lit. Phones lifting around the table, one after another. For 3 seconds, I let myself believe she had surprised me in a good way. Then I read the words written across the top. Oops, still a disappointment. Everyone laughed. I didn't. I stood up calmly, took my bag, and walked toward the exit. My uncle reached out and grabbed my arm, telling me not to make a scene. I leaned in, lowered my voice, and whispered one sentence in his ear. 2 days later, my entire family was in a panic, and none of it was about the cake. The chair scraped loudly against the floor when I stood. It cut through the laughter for half a second, just long enough for a few heads to turn. Someone chuckled harder, as if the sound had made the joke even better. My mother clapped once, sharp and pleased, and said my name the way people do when they expect compliance to follow. "Sit down," she told me. "Don't be dramatic." I didn't look at her. I focused on the strap of my bag as I slid it onto my shoulder, the familiar weight grounding me. The cake sat in the middle of the table, candles still burning, wax dripping into the frosting like it had all the time in the world. My cousin was filming. He didn't bother to hide it. He angled his phone slightly, making sure my face stayed in frame. I could already imagine how it would be captioned later, how the story would be told without me in it. Someone said, "Come on, it's just a joke." Someone else added, "Lighten up." No one asked if I was okay. I stepped away from the table, and that was when my uncle moved. He came around the booth quickly, his hand closing around my forearm with practiced familiarity. Not rough enough to look aggressive, just firm enough to stop me. "Don't do this," he said quietly, his voice pitched low for my benefit alone. "You're embarrassing your mother." The word landed exactly where it always had. I felt it pass through me without sticking. I leaned closer so no one else could hear, so the laughter behind us stayed loud and careless. "I know about the other file," I whispered, "and I kept copies." His grip loosened immediately, not slowly, not with confusion. He let go as if I had burned him. I straightened, nodded once as if we had finished a polite exchange, and kept walking. No one followed me to the door. The laughter picked up again behind me, a little strained now, a little too loud, but still determined to treat what had just happened as entertainment. Outside, the night air felt cooler than it should have. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, listening to the hum of traffic and the muffled noise from inside the restaurant. My hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything. I didn't cry on the way home. I didn't call anyone. I unlocked my apartment, set my bag down by the door, and stood there in the quiet until my shoulders finally dropped. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something closer to confirmation. The next morning passed like any other. I went to work. I answered emails. I ate lunch at my desk. My phone stayed face down, and I didn't check it until I was home again, sitting on the edge of my couch with my shoes still on. There were missed calls. more than I expected. My mother's name appeared first, then my uncle's, then numbers I didn't have saved. Voicemails stacked up without being opened. Messages filled the family group chat, previewed just enough to show that the tone had shifted. Why won't you answer? We need to talk. This is getting out of hand. I turned the phone back over. That second night, I slept better than I had in weeks. It was the kind of sleep that comes when something long avoided has finally been named, even if no one else has said it out loud yet. The panic started to show on the third morning. My mother called from a different number. When I didn't pick up, she sent an email. The subject line was light, almost cheerful, as if that alone could reset everything. My uncle followed with a text that tried to sound casual, but missed the mark by a wide margin. He asked how I was doing. He said he hoped I hadn't taken things the wrong way. By the afternoon, the messages had lost their polish. You need to call me now. This isn't funny anymore. You're misunderstanding something important. I read them slowly, not because they were difficult to understand, but because I was paying attention to what wasn't being said. No one mentioned the cake. No one apologized. No one asked why those words had seemed appropriate. What they wanted was to know what I knew. That night, I finally opened the family group chat. The thread had grown unwieldy in my absence. My mother was trying to frame the dinner as a misunderstanding, a joke that had gone too far because I was under stress. She reminded everyone of how much she had done for me over the years. She talked about intention, about love, about how families sometimes tease each other without meaning harm. My uncle's messages came in bursts. He urged calm. He suggested we talk privately. He wrote about keeping things inside the family, about how outsiders never understand the full picture. A few relatives chimed in with vague statements about forgiveness and moving on. One asked if I was okay, but followed it immediately with a comment about not blowing things out of proportion. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the Notes app on my phone and read through the sentence I had written there months earlier, back when I hadn't known what to do with the information I had found. Back when it had felt safer to pretend it didn't exist. I remembered the afternoon clearly. I had been helping my uncle sort through boxes in his study, a task he had framed as temporary and urgent. Most of the paperwork had been dull and outdated, the kind of documents that exist only to prove time has passed. I hadn't been snooping. I hadn't been looking for anything. Then I had opened the wrong folder. It hadn't been labeled with my name. That was the first thing that made it strange. The contents had been neat, intentional, and unmistakably relevant. Pages that explained more than anyone had ever been willing to say to my face. Pages that answered questions I had learned not to ask. I had taken pictures with my phone, one after another, my hand steady even then. I had put everything back exactly where I found it. I had driven home in silence, my thoughts lining up with a clarity that left no room for excuses. I hadn't confronted anyone. Not then. I hadn't known how or if it would make a difference. I had told myself I would wait for the right moment. When my uncle grabbed my arm in the restaurant, when he leaned in close to tell me not to embarrass my mother, I realized the moment had arrived on its own. By the fourth day, the panic had turned sharper. My mother stopped trying to sound kind. Her messages grew longer, more insistent. She wrote about consequences, about regret, about how families survive by protecting each other. She asked what I thought I was doing. She told me I was hurting people who loved me. Still, no one mentioned the file. Late that evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize, but something in me said to answer. The voice on the other end belonged to a relative who rarely involved herself in family conflict. She spoke carefully, as if every word mattered. She didn't ask about the cake. She asked what I had said to my uncle. When I told her, there was a pause long enough for me to hear her breathe. She didn't sound angry. She sounded worried in a way that had nothing to do with my feelings and everything to do with what might happen next. "You should be careful," she said finally. "If you're right, this is bigger than you think." After the call ended, I sat in the dark and let that settle. Bigger had never scared me as much as smaller had. Smaller was what they had tried to make me feel for years. Smaller was the space they expected me to occupy, quietly grateful for whatever scraps of approval came my way. The birthday dinner had been designed to remind me of that place. The cake, the laughter, the cameras, all of it had been meant to keep me there. Instead, it had done the opposite. I didn't know exactly how things would unfold from there. I didn't know who would side with whom or what would be lost along the way. What I did know was this. The words written in pink frosting had finally said out loud what had always been implied. And once something like that is spoken, once it is celebrated and filmed and laughed at, it stops being a misunderstanding. It becomes a line, and I had already stepped over it. The morning after the dinner felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight came through my blinds at the same angle it always did, hitting the edge of the dresser, warming the same spot on the floor. For a moment, lying there with my eyes open, I wondered if the night before had been exaggerated in my memory. That used to happen. I would replay something sharp and humiliating, then soften it by morning, sanding down the edges until it felt survivable. This time, the image stayed exactly as it was. Pink frosting, candles bending, laughter rising too fast. No blur, no mercy. I got out of bed without the familiar knot in my stomach. That was new. Usually, after anything involving my family, I woke up bracing for the apology I would need to make, the explanation I would owe, the repair work that somehow always landed in my lap. I would rehearse sentences while brushing my teeth, trying to find the right mix of calm and gratitude, the right tone to prove I was not ungrateful, not difficult, not the problem. That morning, my mind was quiet. I showered. I dressed. I made coffee and stood by the counter while it brewed, listening to the low, mechanical gurgle, watching steam curl upward. My phone sat face down beside my keys. I did not reach for it. The urge flickered, then passed, like a habit losing its grip. At work, no one knew anything was different. Emails came in. Meetings started late and ran long. Someone complained about the printer. Someone else brought in donuts. I nodded when appropriate. I answered questions. I laughed once, softly, when a coworker made a comment about how Mondays should be illegal. From the outside, I must have looked fine. Inside, something had shifted. It was not anger. It was not even relief. It was the unsettling absence of guilt. I noticed it when I realized I was not checking my phone between tasks, not wondering who had called, not preparing for the tone of the messages I had not yet read. In the past, silence from my family would have felt like a held breath, pressure building in my chest until I did something to release it. I would reach out first, offering peace before anyone had asked for it. This time, the silence felt spacious. On my lunch break, I sat alone in my car and ate a sandwich I had packed the night before. I watched people cross the parking lot, their routines as predictable as mine. A woman about my mother's age walked by on her phone, gesturing sharply, her expression tight. I wondered, not for the first time, how many of us had learned to manage discomfort by passing it along, shaping it into something that looked like humor or concern. I thought about birthdays before this one. They came back to me not as single events, but as a series of small moments, stacked one on top of another until they formed something heavy. There was the year my mother laughed while telling everyone how I still did not know what I wanted to do with my life, said with a smile that invited agreement. The year she gave me a planner as a gift and joked about how maybe this one would finally help me get organized. The year she raised her glass and said she was proud of me for surviving, as if endurance were the only metric that mattered. Each time, there had been laughter. Each time, someone had said it was all in good fun. Each time, I had smiled and nodded and told myself not to be so sensitive. I used to believe that if enough people laughed, it must mean I was wrong to feel hurt. That was the rule in my family. Discomfort was only valid if it belonged to the loudest person in the room. By mid-afternoon, my phone vibrated once against the desk. I glanced at it out of habit, saw my mother's name light up the screen, and turned it face down again. My pulse did not spike. I did not feel the familiar rush of adrenaline. Instead, there was a mild curiosity, like noticing a storm on the horizon that was still far enough away to be interesting rather than threatening. When I got home that evening, I cooked a simple dinner and ate it standing at the counter. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually made me restless. That night, it felt like permission. I washed the dishes slowly. I wiped the counter. I moved through the space as if it belonged to me in a way it had not before. It was then, rinsing my plate, that I remembered something small from the dinner that had not made sense at the time. It was not the laughter. That had been expected. It was not even the cake. It was my uncle's face just before he stood up. The way his eyes had flicked toward my mother, then back to me, as if checking a signal. The way his smile had tightened, just for a second, before he reached for his glass. At the table, I had been too focused on the words in front of me to notice much else. Now, in the quiet of my kitchen, the image settled into place, connecting itself to a memory I had tried very hard not to examine too closely. Months earlier, I had been at his house helping him sort through paperwork. He had called it a favor, said he just needed an extra set of hands. The room we worked in was cramped and dim, the air stale with old paper and dust. He had been oddly specific about which boxes I should move, which shelves I should avoid. I had noticed it then, the way people notice a loose thread but decide not to pull it. When I opened the folder I was not meant to open, my first instinct had been to close it immediately. It did not feel like a discovery. It felt like a mistake. Even then, before I understood what I was looking at, my body reacted as if I had crossed an invisible line. I had taken pictures anyway, quietly, methodically. Not because I knew what I would do with them, but because something in me recognized that once information like that is revealed, pretending you never saw it becomes a choice. At the time, I told myself I would think about it later, that I did not have enough context, that there must be an explanation that made everything make sense. I told myself that families make mistakes, that intentions matter, that it was better not to jump to conclusions. Standing in my kitchen months later, I saw that moment for what it had been. Not confusion, not caution, training. I had been taught, over years and birthdays and dinners like the one I had just left, to doubt my own reactions, to smooth over discomfort, to assume that if something hurt, it was because I was holding it wrong. That night, I finally turned my phone over. There were missed calls, several. My mother's name appeared more than once, my uncle's too. A few messages from numbers I did not recognize, which meant other relatives had started to talk. I did not open anything. I did not listen to the voicemails. I let the screen go dark again and set the phone down. The next day followed the same quiet rhythm. Work, coffee, emails, no interruptions. By the afternoon, the messages began to stack up. I could see the previews without opening them. We need to talk. You're taking this the wrong way. This has gone far enough. Not once did anyone ask how I was. I noticed that absence the way you notice a missing tooth with your tongue, returning to it again and again. In the past, I would have filled the gap myself, offering reassurance, minimizing my own feelings, reminding everyone that I loved them and did not want to cause problems. This time, I stayed still. The second evening, my brother tried a different approach. His message was shorter, lighter, as if he were testing whether humor might work where concern had failed. He wrote that everyone missed me, that things had gotten weird, that we should all just reset and laugh about it later. I imagined his face as he typed it, the same half-smile he wore when he held up his phone at the table, recording instead of intervening. I did not respond. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I realized something else that felt both small and significant. I was not afraid of what they would say when I finally spoke. I was afraid of what I might say if I did. For years, I had kept my responses careful and controlled, editing myself in real time to avoid escalation. I knew how to soothe. I knew how to redirect. I knew how to disappear just enough to keep the peace. Now, with the words on that cake still vivid in my mind, I understood that peace had always come at my expense. It required me to absorb the impact so that nothing else had to change. The next morning, I woke to a voicemail notification. One, just one. That, too, was new. I listened to it while sitting on the edge of the bed, my feet on the floor, grounded. My uncle's voice came through, measured and calm, the way it always sounded when he wanted to appear reasonable. He said my name. He said he hoped I was okay. He said we should talk privately, just the two of us, before things got misunderstood. He mentioned the dinner only in passing, referred to it as unfortunate, poorly timed, blown out of proportion. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. He said he was worried about me saying things I did not fully understand. I deleted the message without saving it. That was the moment the pattern crystallized. Not in anger, but in clarity. Every time something uncomfortable surfaced, the focus shifted away from the action and on to my reaction. Every time harm was done, the conversation became about my sensitivity, my timing, my tone. The cake had not been a joke that went too far. It had been the most honest thing my family had ever put in front of me. Honest not because it reflected who I was, but because it revealed how they saw me and how useful that image had been. By the end of the second day, the silence on my end had begun to echo loudly on theirs. Messages came in faster now, overlapping, contradicting each other. My mother wrote about love and sacrifice. My uncle wrote about privacy and loyalty. Someone else wrote about forgiveness. They were not coordinated anymore. The neat front they usually presented had started to crack. I sat on my couch that evening, phone in my hand, reading without responding, and felt something settle into place. A recognition that I had been invited over and over again to play a role that kept everyone else comfortable. A recognition that stepping out of it had already changed the shape of the room. I did not yet know how far this would go. I did not know who would stand where when everything was finally said out loud. What I knew was simpler and heavier than that. The words on the cake had stopped being just words. They had become a lens, and through it, I could finally see the pattern I had been taught to ignore. I set the phone down and turned off the light, letting the quiet stretch out around me, knowing that whatever came next would not be built on confusion anymore. The next day, I kept moving through my life like I was carrying something fragile, not because I feared it would break, but because I did not want to drop it out of carelessness. At work, I smiled when someone asked how my weekend had been. I said it was fine. I meant that in a way I had never meant it before. On the drive home, I found myself taking the long way, the route that wound past older neighborhoods with big trees and porch lights that flicked on one by one as the sky dimmed. I watched a couple in their 60s walking a small dog, moving at an unhurried pace like they had earned the right to go slow. It made my throat tighten, not with sadness, but with a kind of longing, that steadiness, that quiet dignity, the feeling of being allowed to exist without being evaluated. When I pulled into my parking spot, my phone vibrated again. Another message, another missed call. I did not look. I carried my groceries upstairs and set them on the counter, then stood there for a moment with my hands resting on the bag handles, feeling the weight of everything that had been unsaid for years. The memory I kept circling was not the cake itself. It was my uncle moving fast, the practiced way he stepped in front of me, the firm grip on my arm that was just polite enough to look like concern. It was the way his face changed when I whispered in his ear. Not confusion, not anger, fear. That reaction had not started at the dinner. It had started months earlier, in a room that smelled like paper and dust, when I opened something I was not meant to see. Back then, it began with a phone call on a Saturday morning. My uncle told me he had a mess to sort through, asked if I could come over and help him organize a few boxes. He made it sound like nothing. He always did. He had a way of framing his requests like favors I should be grateful to provide, as if my time was an open resource and his needs were inherently reasonable. I had said yes because I still believed saying no would create drama, and I had spent most of my life trying to avoid being blamed for it. When I arrived at his house, the air inside was cool and artificially clean, like the heat had been kept low to preserve the furniture. He greeted me with a quick hug, all shoulder and pat, then led me down a hallway toward a small room off the back of the house. He called it his study. It was really a storage space with a desk shoved into the corner. The room felt cramped. Cardboard boxes were stacked in uneven towers along the walls, some labeled, some not. A filing cabinet sat near the desk with drawers that stuck when you tried to open them. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but the dust did not feel accidental. It felt like part of a system. Things you do not want people looking at get left alone long enough for a film of time to settle over them. He rubbed his hands together and nodded toward a pile of boxes. "Those need to go in the garage," he said, "and those over there need to be sorted. I just want to know what I've got." He positioned himself in the desk chair and winced slightly, as if sitting hurt his back. He made a little show of it, the way he did when he wanted sympathy without having to ask. I told myself not to judge. I told myself people get older, people get sore, people need help. Still, I noticed he did not stand again. I started moving boxes toward the hall. Most were heavy with paper, the kind of weight that comes from years of keeping receipts, manuals, and outdated mail. I set them in the garage, then came back inside and began opening the ones he wanted sorted. It was dull work at first. Old bank statements, warranty booklets, handwritten notes from contractors, holiday cards. I made neat stacks, recycling what was obviously trash, placing the rest into piles based on category. My uncle watched with a faint smile that never reached his eyes. He asked casual questions about my life, what I was doing for work, whether I had thought about going back to school, whether I had considered moving closer to family. His questions landed with the same undertone I had heard at every dinner table. "How long are you going to keep drifting? When are you going to fix yourself?" I answered politely. I kept my focus on the boxes. Halfway through, I pulled a heavy plastic bin out from under a shelf. It was tucked deeper than the others, pressed behind a stack of old textbooks. The lid was latched. I assumed it was just more paperwork, and I was on autopilot by then, working through the mess one container at a time. I unclipped the latches and lifted the lid. Inside, the contents were not loose and messy like the rest. Everything was stacked cleanly, held together with binder clips and folder tabs. The papers looked newer, the edges crisp, the ink darker. On top sat a thin folder with a simple label, nothing decorative, just a couple of words typed on a white sticker. I remember the exact sensation of my stomach dropping. Not because I knew what it was, but because my body recognized the feeling of being near something that had been kept from me. I glanced back at my uncle. He was looking down at his phone. His leg bounced slightly, a nervous little movement that did not match his calm voice. I told myself to close the bin and move on. I told myself I had no business digging into anything that was not mine. Then I saw a familiar detail on the first page inside that folder. My own information. Not my name on the label, not in big letters, but my birth date printed in a line of text, the way institutions print it, flat and impersonal. It was enough to stop me cold. I did not flip through the pages quickly. I turned them slowly, one at a time, as if moving too fast would make the truth jump out and bite me. The paperwork was not sentimental. It was formal. Forms, notices, signatures, blocks of text with fine print and official language. My uncle's name appeared more than once. My mother's name appeared too. There were references to accounts and designations and responsibilities, words that made my scalp prickle because they did not belong in the casual world of birthday dinners and family jokes. I felt heat rise into my face, then drain away, leaving me cold. I listened for any shift in the house, any footstep, any sign that he had noticed. The room stayed quiet except for the soft rasp of paper against paper and the faint buzz of his phone when it received a notification. I took out my own phone. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I framed each page and snapped a picture, then another, then another. I did not try to read everything in that moment. I focused on capturing it. If I stopped to process, I might hesitate. If I hesitated, I might put it back and convince myself none of it mattered. As I photographed the documents, a pattern began to emerge. Dates clustered around key moments in my life. Names repeated. Certain sections were highlighted in pen. There was an attached note on one page with a scribble in my uncle's handwriting, the casualness of it making the whole thing feel even more sinister. He had written as if he were solving a routine problem, not handling something tied to a person's identity and future. I kept going until my camera roll held a full record. Then I put everything back exactly as I found it. Every page aligned, every clip returned to the same position. I closed the folder. I set it on top. I lowered the lid on the bin and snapped the latches shut with a soft click. The sound was small, but it felt loud. My heart thudded once, hard. I slid the bin back under the shelf and stood up, forcing my body to move normally. I carried another box to the garage, my arms working on muscle memory while my mind raced in a tight circle. When I came back into the study, my uncle looked up and smiled. He asked if I wanted water. He told me I was a lifesaver. He made a joke about how he should hire me as an assistant. I nodded. I smiled. I said I was happy to help. The words tasted strange in my mouth. I finished sorting the rest of the boxes without seeing them. Every piece of paper I touched felt like a decoy. Everything in that room suddenly seemed staged, like the real story was hidden just beneath the surface, and I had only brushed against it. When I left his house that afternoon, he hugged me again, just as quick and empty as before. He told me to drive safe. He said we should do dinner soon. I drove home with my phone in the passenger seat, the screen dark, the evidence tucked inside it like a living thing. At red lights, I stared straight ahead and tried to breathe normally. My thoughts came in waves. There has to be an explanation. This is probably nothing. Why would they keep this from me? Why is my birth date on a form in his study? Why is Mom's name here? Why is his name here? Why does this date match the year everything started to feel harder? By the time I pulled into my apartment parking lot, the sun was low and my hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel. I sat in the car for a long moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. I wanted to call someone. I wanted to demand answers. I wanted to make it stop. Instead, I did nothing. That decision did not come from wisdom. It came from fear, the kind that makes you freeze rather than fight. The fear that if I brought it up, they would laugh. The fear that they would flip it back on me, tell me I did not understand, tell me I was imagining things, tell me I was being dramatic. I had been trained to doubt myself. I knew that. Even then, I knew it. And still I felt it in my bones. So I waited. I saved the photos to a hidden folder. I backed them up to an email draft I never sent. I moved through my days as if the information were a weight strapped to my chest that no one else could see. Every time my mother called, I wondered if she knew that I knew. Every time my uncle texted, I wondered if he was checking the temperature, trying to see if the secret had stayed buried. And then my birthday dinner happened, and the cake arrived, and the words were written in frosting like a headline. It was public, careless, cruel. I walked out and did not look back. Now, sitting in my apartment days later, I understood why that folder had haunted me. It was not just that it existed. It was that it explained the shape of my life in a way no one had ever admitted. Certain opportunities that never materialized. Certain conversations that always ended with vague promises and sudden silence. The way my mother watched me like she was waiting for me to fail, as if my failure would make something else easier to justify. The family group chat kept buzzing. I watched the messages stack up without opening them, the phone lighting up and going dark again. I could picture my mother pacing her kitchen. I could picture my uncle sitting in that same desk chair, leg bouncing, phone in hand, trying to calculate how much I might know. It hit me then, clear and sharp, that the birthday humiliation had not been random. It had been a reset button, a way to push me back into the small version of myself they preferred, the version who would feel ashamed and apologize and retreat. But I had not retreated. I had gone quiet, and quiet had made them nervous. I finally opened the group chat and scrolled. There were messages from relatives who rarely spoke. A few were supportive in a vague way, telling me not to take it personally, telling me everyone makes mistakes. Others were annoyed, accusing me of creating drama. My mother wrote long paragraphs about love and family and how hard it is to be a parent. My uncle wrote shorter ones about privacy and loyalty and keeping things inside the family. None of them said the obvious. None of them named what had happened at that table. I set my phone down and walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot below. A neighbor got out of her car and carried a bag of laundry inside. Somewhere, a dog barked. Life kept moving like it always did, indifferent to my family's panic. I pressed my palm to the cool glass and felt my breathing slow. In my mind, I replayed the moment in the restaurant when my uncle grabbed my arm. I saw the careful way he positioned his body between me and the room, as if his job was to manage outcomes. I remembered how he told me I was embarrassing my mother. Then I remembered his face when I whispered the sentence. I know about the other file, and I kept copies. I had not said it to be cruel. I had said it because it was true, and because truth was the only thing in that family that had ever made people stop laughing. That night, I pulled up the photos again. I sat on the couch with my laptop open, scrolling through the images one by one. Some pages were still hard to understand, full of language meant to confuse regular people. But other parts were simple enough. Names, dates, signatures. I stopped on one page and stared at it longer than the rest. My pulse picked up, not because I had discovered something new, but because I was finally letting myself look at what I already had. I thought about my uncle's fear, the way it had flashed across his face and then disappeared behind a mask of calm. I thought about the way my mother had clapped, delighted, as if humiliation were a harmless game. A small part of me still wanted to believe there was a softer explanation, a misunderstanding, a mistake, some detail I had missed that would make everything okay. But my body did not believe that anymore. I closed the laptop slowly and sat in the dark, letting the quiet settle around me, knowing the next step was no longer about whether I had proof. It was about what I was willing to do with it. I woke up with the taste of frosting still in my mouth, even though I had not eaten a single bite of that cake. The image followed me through the morning like a shadow that refused to line up with the light. I brushed my teeth longer than usual, watching my reflection, half expecting to see the words written there too, faint and pink, clinging to my skin. The day moved slowly, not because anything was wrong on the surface, but because my mind kept circling the same moment from the night before. The timing of it. The way the server appeared just as the conversation shifted away from me and towards something else. The way everyone was already holding their phones, already prepared to record a reaction they assumed would be predictable. At my desk, I stared at an email without reading it, replaying the scene again and again. The cake did not arrive at the end of dinner by accident. It arrived when my mother had finished listing examples of people my age who were doing better than me. It arrived when the attention had started to drift, when the energy at the table needed a spark. The joke had landed exactly where it was meant to, redirecting focus, resetting the hierarchy. For years, I had accepted those moments as awkward missteps, jokes that went too far because no one thought about how they would feel to the person on the receiving end. That explanation no longer held. It fell apart under even the lightest pressure. I thought about the wording itself. Not lazy, not dramatic. Still a disappointment. The phrase was specific. It echoed things that had been said behind closed doors, complaints framed as concern, frustrations disguised as love. This time it had been written out, piped carefully in frosting, paid for and presented with candles. It was not a punchline, it was a declaration. I remembered how my mother had clapped, delighted, as if she had pulled off a perfect surprise. How my brother had laughed too loudly, phone lifted just a little higher. How my stepfather had watched me with that familiar look, waiting to see if I would make things uncomfortable by reacting. And then, there was my uncle. The more I replayed it, the more his behavior stood out. He had not laughed right away. He had glanced at my mother first, quick and subtle, like he was checking a cue. When he stood to stop me, it had been immediate, instinctive. He had moved before anyone else even realized what I was doing. That was not the reaction of someone embarrassed by a joke gone wrong. It was the reaction of someone trying to contain a situation. During my lunch break, I walked around the block instead of eating. The air was cool, the kind that carries the smell of fallen leaves and distant traffic. Each step felt deliberate, grounding. I needed to think without distraction. The file I had found months earlier came back to me in fragments. Not the details yet, but the feeling. The sharp awareness that I was looking at something that explained too much. At the time, I had pushed that feeling aside, telling myself I was overthinking, that families have paperwork, that not everything is meant to be shared. Now, with the cake burned into my memory, that rationalization sounded hollow. I stopped at a crosswalk and watched the light change. A woman about my age stood beside me, scrolling through her phone, her face tense. On the other side of the street, an older couple waited patiently, hands clasped, comfortable in their silence. I wondered how many years it took to build that ease, and how many small humiliations I had absorbed instead of setting boundaries that could have led me there sooner. Back at my desk, my phone buzzed. Another message from my mother. I did not open it, but I could see the preview, her words carefully chosen, already working to rewrite the narrative. She mentioned how hurt she was that I left so abruptly. She mentioned how people were asking questions. She did not mention the cake. The omission felt louder than any accusation. That evening, I sat on my couch with the lights off, letting the glow from the street filter in through the window. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the photos I had taken in my uncle's study, stopping on images I had avoided looking at too closely before. This time, I did not rush. I let myself read. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Certain decisions aligned with moments when I had been told there was no room, no money, no time. Certain signatures appeared together, consistent and deliberate. This was not chaos. It was coordination. The realization did not come with a rush of anger. It came with a steady, sinking certainty. The humiliation at the restaurant had not been about putting me in my place for its own sake. It had been about reinforcing a story that made other choices easier to justify. If I was a disappointment, then anything done without my knowledge could be framed as necessary. If I was unreliable, then excluding me from decisions could be called protection. The cake made sense in that context. It was a reminder, not just to me, but to everyone else at the table, of who I was supposed to be. I thought about who benefited from that moment. My mother, who had spent years presenting herself as patient and long-suffering, finally got to say out loud what she believed. My brother, who rarely faced scrutiny, got to be part of the joke instead of the target. My uncle, who had always positioned himself as the fixer, got to step in and manage the fallout. And me. I was supposed to feel small, ashamed, grateful that they tolerated me at all. Instead, I had stood up and left. That departure had created a vacuum they were not prepared for. I imagined the table after I was gone, the laughter tapering off, the cake sitting there, candles melting down into waxy puddles. Someone making a comment about how I had overreacted, too sensitive as usual. Someone else agreeing, eager to smooth things over. But then what? The silence. The question of what I might do next. I did not need to be there to know how uncomfortable that would have felt for them. I had lived my whole life absorbing that discomfort so they would not have to. Later that night, my phone rang. I recognized my uncle's number and let it go to voicemail. When the notification appeared, I did not listen right away. I already knew the shape of what he would say. He would sound calm, reasonable. He would frame my reaction as the problem, not the cause. When I finally played it, his voice confirmed my expectation. He spoke slowly, carefully. He said he wanted to clear the air. He said there were things I did not fully understand. He said family matters should stay within the family. I noticed how often he used the word family and how little he used my name. I deleted the message and sat there, phone resting in my lap, feeling a strange mix of sadness and resolve. Sadness for the version of myself that had waited so long for kindness that never came. Resolve because I finally understood that clarity was not cruelty. The next morning, the messages multiplied. My mother wrote again, longer this time, her words weaving together sacrifice and hurt, painting herself as the one who had been wronged. She mentioned how embarrassed she felt, how people were talking, how she had always tried to support me. She asked why I would do this to her. I read it twice, not because it was confusing, but because I wanted to be sure I was seeing it clearly. There was no acknowledgement of harm, no question about why those words had been chosen, just a demand that I fix the discomfort I had caused by refusing to play along. For the first time, I did not feel tempted to respond. As the day wore on, I began to notice something else. The tone of the messages shifted. Where there had been dismissal, there was now urgency. Where there had been mockery, there was now caution. My mother's words softened. My uncle's messages became shorter, more frequent. Someone else reached out. Someone who rarely contacted me directly, asking if everything was okay, if we could talk. They were recalibrating. That realization settled over me with a quiet weight. The power in my family had always belonged to the people who controlled the narrative. By leaving without explaining myself, by refusing to immediately apologize or clarify, I had disrupted that control. I thought again about the file, about how long it had been sitting there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for me to stumble across it. I thought about how easily I had almost closed it, how close I had come to convincing myself it was none of my business. The cake had forced the issue. It had stripped away the last layer of plausible deniability. Once something is said publicly, once it is laughed at and recorded, it becomes harder to pretend it was never meant. That night, I took out a notebook and began writing. Not sentences, just facts. Dates. Names. Moments that now made sense in a way they never had before. I did not know yet what I would do with them. I only knew that keeping them in my head was no longer enough. As I wrote, I felt the familiar urge to soften my language, to add qualifiers, to make room for everyone else's feelings. I stopped myself. I wrote things as they were, not as I wished they had been. When I finished, I closed the notebook and set it on the table beside me. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that allows you to hear your own breathing, your own thoughts. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel cruel. I felt awake. The words on the cake had finally aligned with everything that came before them. They were not an accident. They were a signal. And I had read it correctly. As I turned off the light and headed to bed, my phone buzzed once more on the table. I did not check it. I already knew what it would be. They were afraid now, not of my feelings, but of what I might do with the clarity I had gained. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, letting that truth settle, understanding that whatever came next would not be about explaining myself anymore. It would be about choosing how much of the truth I was willing to let stay hidden. I decided not to answer anyone. The choice felt deliberate the moment it formed, not dramatic or reactive, just clear. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and walked away from it, as if putting physical distance between myself and the noise might help me hear my own thoughts more clearly. For years, silence had been something done to me, messages left unanswered, questions brushed aside, decisions made without my input. I had learned to fill that silence myself, to explain, to justify, to smooth things over so no one else had to sit with discomfort. This time, I let the quiet stand. The first few hours passed without incident. I went to work, answered emails, attended a meeting where someone spent too long debating font size. Life continued with its usual indifference. It was almost disappointing how normal everything felt. I had expected the decision to feel heavier, more defiant. Instead, it felt like finally putting down a bag I had been carrying so long I had forgotten its weight. By lunchtime, my phone vibrated twice in quick succession. I did not check it. I finished my salad, wiped my hands on a napkin, and went back to my desk. A small part of me waited for the familiar spike of anxiety, the reflexive urge to fix whatever was happening before it got worse. It did not come. That afternoon, the tone of the messages began to shift, even without me reading them. I could tell by the frequency. The pauses between vibrations grew shorter. The screen lit up more often. Whatever calm narrative my family had tried to maintain after the dinner was starting to fray. When I finally allowed myself to look, it was not curiosity that drove me, but observation. I read the previews without opening the messages fully, the way you might glance at a weather report without stepping outside. My mother's texts came first, still wrapped in concern. She wrote that she was worried about me, that she had not slept well, that she hated going to bed with things unsettled. She suggested we talk soon, just the two of us, to clear the air. The words were soft, but the pressure underneath them was familiar. My uncle's messages followed, shorter and more controlled. He said we needed to address this before it got misunderstood. He said people were talking. He said I might be saying things I did not fully grasp. That sentence caught my attention, not because it was new, but because of how quickly it appeared. I had not said anything to anyone except him, and only a single sentence at that. Yet he was already preemptively framing my silence as dangerous, as if the mere possibility of my speaking posed a threat. I set the phone down again and let the afternoon pass. By the second day, the concern had given way to urgency. The messages came earlier in the morning and later at night. Different family members reached out, some of whom rarely contacted me directly. An aunt sent a vague text asking if everything was okay. A cousin wrote that things felt tense, and maybe we should all calm down. No one asked what had hurt me. I noticed that omission the way you notice a draft in a room that keeps brushing past your neck. It was subtle, but persistent. The focus was not on understanding what had happened, but on containing the situation, on restoring the appearance of normalcy. At work, I moved through my tasks with an ease that surprised me. My thoughts were clearer. I did not find myself replaying conversations or rehearsing responses. When my manager asked if I could take on an extra project, I said I would look at my schedule and let her know. I did not immediately agree out of habit. Even that small pause felt like a quiet assertion of control. That evening, I took a walk around my neighborhood as the sun dipped low. The sidewalks were dotted with people heading home, carrying groceries, walking dogs, chatting on phones. I passed a woman about my mother's age watering her plants, her radio playing softly. She nodded at me and smiled, a small, ordinary gesture that felt oddly grounding. This, I thought, was what life looked like when you were not constantly bracing for judgment. When I got back to my apartment, my phone was buzzing again. I picked it up this time, scrolling through the messages slowly, deliberately. Patterns emerged quickly. Certain phrases repeated across different senders, as if they had been agreed upon. We need to talk. This has gone too far. You're misunderstanding things. Family sticks together. The absence of apology was striking. No one said they were sorry for the cake. No one acknowledged how those words might have landed. The narrative had already shifted to my reaction, my silence, my refusal to engage. Late that night, I listened to a voicemail from my uncle that I had let sit for hours. His voice was calm, almost soothing, the way it always was when he wanted to sound reasonable. He said my name, then paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. He said he was concerned. He said it would be better if we talked privately before this spiraled. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. He mentioned the file, not directly, not by name, but he referenced details I had not shared with anyone else, information that could only have come from the thing I had found in his study months earlier. He spoke as if assuming I had already misunderstood it, as if setting the stage to correct me before I even explained myself. I ended the message without listening to the rest. That was the first real slip. Up until then, there had been room, however small, to believe I was misreading their panic, to think they were simply reacting to an unexpected conflict. But that voicemail confirmed what my instincts had been circling for days. They were not afraid of my feelings. They were afraid of my knowledge. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep that comes after a decision has been made, even if you do not yet know all its consequences. When I woke, the sun was already high, and my phone was quiet for the first time in days. The calm did not last. By mid-morning, the messages resumed, this time from unfamiliar numbers. People I had not spoken to in years reached out under the guise of checking in. Their words were awkward, their concern forced. One asked if I was okay. Another said she hoped there was nothing serious going on. A third suggested that families sometimes hurt each other without meaning to. I recognized the tactic immediately. They were expanding the circle, hoping someone else might reach me in a way they could not. Hoping I would explain myself to the wrong person, reveal too much, or soften my stance out of politeness. I did none of those things. Instead, I noticed how quickly their coordination was breaking down. Messages contradicted each other. One relative insisted everything was a misunderstanding. Another hinted at serious consequences if this continued. Someone suggested a group call. Someone else warned against involving outsiders. They were no longer speaking with one voice. That afternoon, my phone rang from a number I recognized, but had not seen light up my screen in years. It belonged to a relative who lived several states away. someone who had always stayed on the edges of family drama, present at holidays, but careful not to get pulled into conflicts. I hesitated before answering, then did. Her voice was quiet, measured. She did not start with accusations or concern. She asked how I was doing, and she waited for my answer without rushing to fill the silence. When I told her I was okay, she did not contradict me. She did not mention the cake. Instead, she said she had heard things were tense and wanted to make sure I was being careful. She spoke in a way that suggested she knew more than she was saying, choosing her words with deliberate restraint. When I asked what she meant, there was a pause long enough for me to hear her breathe. She said there were matters in our family that had been handled poorly for a long time. She said my silence had caused some alarm. She said it might be wise to think carefully about my next steps. She did not ask me to back down. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my couch, phone still in my hand, staring at the wall across from me. That call felt different from all the others. There was no attempt to manage my emotions, no subtle pressure to restore peace at my own expense. It was a warning, not a plea. By the end of the second day, the panic was unmistakable. My mother's messages grew longer, more emotional. She wrote about everything she had sacrificed, about how hard it was to be a parent, about how she had always tried her best. She framed my silence as cruelty, as punishment, as a betrayal of the family. I read her words with a strange detachment. In the past, they would have unraveled me. I would have rushed to reassure her, to tell her I loved her, to promise I would never intentionally hurt her. Now I noticed what was missing. There was still no acknowledgement of the harm done to me. No reflection on why those words had been chosen for my cake. No curiosity about how it felt to sit there while everyone laughed. The pattern was complete. That evening, I laid out the photos from my phone on my laptop. Not physically, but mentally. I thought about the dates, the signatures, the careful way information had been compartmentalized. I thought about my uncle's fear and my mother's performative delight. I realized then that my silence was doing something no confrontation ever had. It was forcing them to sit with uncertainty, to imagine what I might know, who I might tell, what I might do next. They had built their comfort on my predictability, on the certainty that I would explain myself, apologize, retreat. By refusing to play that role, I had unsettled the entire structure. Late that night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed one last time. A message from my uncle, shorter than the rest. "We need to talk now." I did not respond. I set the phone on the nightstand, turned off the light, and lay back, listening to the quiet hum of the building settling around me. My thoughts were steady, not racing, not frantic. For the first time, I understood that time was no longer on their side, and I was no longer in a hurry. The call came late in the afternoon from a number I almost did not recognize at first. I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing a mug when my phone lit up on the counter. The name attached to it belonged to someone who rarely reached out directly, someone who had spent most of their life positioned just far enough from the center of my family to avoid being pulled into its gravity. I dried my hands slowly before answering. Something in me already knew this call would not sound like the others. Her voice was calm, careful, and unhurried. She asked how I was doing and waited, actually waited, instead of filling the silence with concern or advice. When I told her I was managing, she did not contradict me or soften it with platitudes. She said she was glad to hear it and then paused again, as if choosing every word with intention. She made it clear right away that she was not calling on my mother's behalf. She said she had not been asked to intervene. She said she was calling because she had been watching the situation unfold from a distance and felt uneasy about how quickly things were escalating. I leaned against the counter and listened, letting the quiet stretch between us. Her tone was different from the rest of my family, There was no edge of accusation, no attempt to frame me as the problem that needed fixing. If anything, she sounded concerned in a way that had nothing to do with my feelings and everything to do with consequences. She said she was aware that something significant had been kept from me for a long time. She did not describe it in detail, but the way she spoke made it clear she was not guessing. She said she had known for years that certain decisions had been made without my knowledge, and that those decisions had created complications no one wanted to address openly. Hearing that did something strange to me. It did not shock me. It steadied me. For months, I had carried the weight of what I found in my uncle's study alone, unsure whether I was seeing clearly or projecting meaning onto something I did not fully understand. To hear someone else acknowledge it, even obliquely, felt like stepping onto solid ground after standing on shifting sand. She did not apologize on anyone's behalf. She did not try to explain motives or soften intent. She spoke in facts and implications, not emotions. She said my silence after the birthday dinner had caused alarm because it was unexpected. She said people had assumed I would react emotionally, make accusations, demand explanations. They had prepared for that version of me. They had not prepared for quiet. She told me that quiet had a way of forcing people to imagine outcomes they could not control. She warned me that once that kind of fear sets in, behavior changes quickly. People make mistakes. They overcorrect. They reveal more than they mean to. I asked her why she was telling me this now. She took a breath and said that she had ignored her own discomfort for too long, that she had seen things over the years that did not sit right. Comments made, decisions rushed, explanations that never quite lined up. She said she had told herself it was not her place to intervene, that families were complicated, that she did not want to create conflict. She paused, then said that watching my family laugh at that cake had shifted something for her. That kind of cruelty, done publicly and treated as humor, had stripped away the last excuse she had been holding on to. She said she was not asking me to do anything specific. She said she wanted me to understand that I was not imagining the scale of what I had uncovered, that what I found was part of a larger pattern, one that extended beyond hurt feelings and into areas that could not be smoothed over with apologies. When the call ended, I stood there for a long moment, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. The apartment felt very quiet, but not empty. There was a sense of weight shifting, of something settling into place. For the first time since the dinner, I did not feel alone in what I knew. I sat down at the table and opened my laptop, pulling up the folder where I had stored the images from my phone. I scrolled through them slowly, letting her words reframe what I was seeing. Details I had skimmed over before now stood out with new clarity. The consistency of the handwriting, the repetition of names, the way decisions clustered around certain years, certain moments when my life had taken turns that never fully made sense. This was not a series of isolated choices. It was a structure. I thought about how often I had been told that things were not possible for me, that resources were limited, that timing was bad. I thought about how often those explanations had come paired with gentle criticism, reminders of my supposed lack of direction, my tendency to drift. It was easier to deny someone support if you could convince everyone, including them, that they did not deserve it yet. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my mother. I did not open it. I already knew the rhythm of her words. Concern first, then guilt, then sacrifice. Always framed in a way that placed the burden of repair squarely on my shoulders. Instead, I thought about what the woman on the phone had said about mistakes, about people revealing more than they intend when they feel cornered. That night, I slept lightly but deeply, as if my body were resting even while my mind stayed alert. In the morning, I woke with a sense of direction I had not felt in a long time. Not urgency, direction. I went to work and moved through my tasks with quiet focus. When a coworker complained about her sister and rolled her eyes, I listened with empathy, but without absorbing the emotion. I noticed how often women are expected to carry family discomfort as a kind of unpaid labor, smoothing and soothing and making space for everyone else. On my lunch break, I walked instead of eating. The sky was pale blue, the air crisp. I watched leaves skitter across the sidewalk and thought about how much energy I had spent over the years trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. When I got home that evening, I made a list, not of grievances, but of facts. Names, dates, actions. I did not embellish or interpret. I wrote only what I could verify, what existed on paper, what could be traced. It felt grounding, like building a spine for something that had been shapeless before. Halfway through, my phone rang again. This time, it was my uncle. I let it ring. A minute later, a message came through. Short, insistent. He said we needed to talk and that this had gone far enough. He said I was risking something I did not understand. I read it once, then set the phone down. What struck me was not the warning itself, but the shift in tone. The calm reasonableness had given way to something sharper. The mask was slipping. I thought back to his study, to the way he had positioned himself in the chair that day, directing me to move boxes while he stayed seated. The way he had kept certain areas just out of reach. The way his leg had bounced when I lifted the lid on that bin. He had always been the one who managed logistics in the family, the one who handled details, smoothed transitions, took care of things quietly behind the scenes. Power like that rarely announces itself. It prefers to remain invisible, until it feels threatened. Later that night, the woman who had called earlier sent a brief follow-up message. She said she wanted to emphasize one thing, that whatever I chose to do next, it should be done deliberately and with documentation. That acting out of anger would give others something to dismiss. That patience would give me leverage. Leverage. The word landed solidly. I had never thought of myself as someone who held leverage. I had been taught to believe that my value came from accommodation, from being easy, from not making waves. The idea that I might have something others feared losing felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. And yet, everything around me suggested it was true. I looked again at the messages piling up on my phone, the overlapping pleas, the contradictions, the sudden interest from people who had been indifferent for years. It all pointed to the same conclusion. My family was afraid not because I was angry, but because I was no longer predictable. That realization did not make me feel powerful in the way movies portray it. There was no rush, no thrill. What I felt instead was a quiet resolve, the kind that comes from finally seeing a situation clearly enough to stop negotiating with yourself about it. I closed my laptop and stood, stretching my shoulders, feeling the familiar tension there begin to loosen. Outside, the evening had settled in, lights flickering on in neighboring apartments. Somewhere, a television murmured through a wall. Life went on, indifferent to the shift taking place inside me. I knew the next phase would require movement, not just observation. That what I had gathered so far was only the beginning. The woman on the phone had been right about one thing above all. I was not acting alone anymore, and that changed everything. I picked up my phone, not to respond to the messages waiting there, but to open a new note. I titled it simply and began adding to the list, methodical and calm, aware that what I was building now would soon need to stand on its own. When I finished, I saved it and set the phone back down, letting the room fall quiet again, understanding that the time for watching was coming to an end, and that the next step would require me to follow the trail wherever it led. I did not tell anyone where I was going the morning I left my apartment early with a folder tucked into my bag. The sky was still pale, the kind of light that makes everything look unfinished, and the city felt quieter than usual, as if it were holding its breath with me. The building I walked into was modest, set back from the street between a dry cleaner and a dentist's office. There was nothing dramatic about it. No grand entrance, no marble floors. Just a glass door with hours posted neatly beside it, and a waiting room that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. I checked in at the desk and took a seat, my hands folded in my lap, my bag resting against my leg like an anchor. Around me, other people waited, flipping through magazines, staring at their phones, each of us carrying our own version of something unresolved. I watched an older woman adjust her scarf, her movements careful, practiced. I wondered what had brought her there, what line she had finally decided she could not let be crossed anymore. When my name was called, I stood and followed the assistant down a short hallway into an office that felt intentionally neutral. A desk, 2 chairs, a bookshelf lined with thick binders, a framed print on the wall that looked chosen more for its inoffensiveness than its beauty. The man who stood to greet me was polite, professional, and unremarkable, in a way that immediately put me at ease. He did not rush. He did not soften his words with unnecessary sympathy. He asked me to sit, and then asked me to tell him what brought me there, starting wherever felt most natural. I took a breath and began. I did not start with the cake. I did not start with the humiliation or the laughter. I started with what I could prove. The folder in my uncle's study, the documents, the dates, the way I had found them by accident while doing him a favor. I laid the story out carefully, not dramatizing, not minimizing. I told it the way I would tell someone I respected, someone whose job depended on clarity. He listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes, his expression steady. When I finished, I slid the folder across the desk. Inside were printed copies of the images I had taken, organized and labeled. I had spent the night before making sure everything was clear, legible, complete. He took his time reading through them. The silence stretched, but it did not feel awkward. It felt purposeful. I watched his eyes move from page to page, pausing here and there, the faintest tightening at the corners betraying concentration. When he finally looked up, he did not ask me how it made me feel. He asked me a question that landed with surprising weight. Had anyone ever explained this to you? I shook my head. He nodded once, as if that confirmed something he had already suspected. He began to explain what he was seeing, not in legal jargon meant to impress, but in plain language meant to be understood. He pointed out patterns I had noticed myself and others I had not. He spoke about responsibilities attached to names on documents, about intent and designation, about what it meant when funds or decisions were directed away from their stated purpose. He was careful not to promise outcomes. He did not dramatize possibilities. What he offered instead was clarity. He told me what questions would need to be answered, what records could be requested, what timelines mattered, what steps could be taken if I chose to move forward. If I chose. That distinction mattered to him, and it mattered to me. When he asked what I wanted, I did not answer right away. I stared at the edge of the desk, the grain of the wood suddenly fascinating. I thought about the years I had spent doubting myself, the times I had been told I was overreacting, misremembering, taking things too personally. I thought about how easily this could all be framed as a misunderstanding if I allowed it. Then I thought about the cake again, about how deliberate it had been, about how public. I told him I wanted the truth documented. I told him I wanted to understand the full scope of what had been done and to whom. I said I did not know yet what I would do with that information, but I knew I could not keep carrying it alone. He nodded again, this time slower. He told me that was a reasonable place to start. When I left the office, the sun was higher, the day fully awake. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the noise of traffic wash over me. I did not feel lighter exactly, but I felt steadier, as if I had finally set something down on solid ground instead of balancing it precariously in my arms. On the drive home, my phone buzzed repeatedly in the passenger seat. I did not look at it. I knew who it would be. I knew the tone before reading a single word. By the time I reached my apartment, there were several missed calls and a string of messages waiting. I scanned them quickly, just enough to register the escalation. My uncle's words were sharper now, stripped of their earlier restraint. He accused me of dragging strangers into family matters. He warned me about consequences. He said I was being reckless. My mother's messages ran parallel but different, heavy with emotion. She wrote about betrayal, about how hurt she was, about how she could not believe I would do this to her after everything she had done for me. She asked what she had done to deserve this. Not once did she ask what she had done to me. I set the phone down and went to the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. My hands were steady. That alone felt like a small victory. The next few days unfolded in a strange rhythm. Outwardly, my life remained the same. Work, errands, meals eaten alone. Inwardly, something fundamental had shifted. Every message I received, every call I ignored, felt less like an assault and more like data. I began to notice inconsistencies, different versions of the same story circulating through different relatives. One person insisted I was confused, another suggested I was being manipulated. A third hinted that I was overestimating my position. The lack of coordination was telling. The woman who had called me earlier in the week checked in again, briefly. She did not ask for details. She simply asked if I was okay. When I told her I had taken steps to protect myself, she responded with a single line that stayed with me. Good. That means you are finally being taken seriously. That evening, I received a message from someone I had not expected. A cousin I had always liked, but never been particularly close to. She wrote carefully, her words measured. She said she had heard bits and pieces of what was going on and wanted to understand. She said she did not want to get in the middle, but she did not feel right staying silent either. We spoke on the phone later that night. She told me things she had noticed over the years, small comments, odd decisions, moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt connected. She said she had always assumed there was a reason she did not know. Now she was not so sure. Talking to her felt different from every other conversation I had had that week. There was no pressure to fix anything, no attempt to redirect my emotions, just shared observation, quiet and honest. When we hung up, I realized how rare that had been in my life, how seldom anyone in my family had simply listened without trying to manage the outcome. The next morning, my uncle showed up at my building. I was not expecting him, but something in me had sensed this was coming. The escalation had reached a point where indirect pressure was no longer enough. He needed to see me, to assess me, to try to regain control. I saw him through the window as he stood in the lobby, his posture rigid, his phone in his hand. For a moment, I considered not going down. I had no obligation to let him in, but avoiding him would not end this, and part of me was tired of moving around other people's discomfort. I took a breath and went downstairs. He turned when he saw me, relief flickering across his face before he masked it. He stepped forward, his voice low, urgent. He said we needed to talk privately. He said this had gone too far. I told him we could talk right there. The lobby was quiet, the afternoon lull settling in. The receptionist glanced up briefly, then went back to her computer. He hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. He told me I was making a mistake. He said I did not understand the full picture. He said I was risking relationships that could never be repaired. I listened without interrupting, watching his face as he spoke. I noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. This was not concern for me. This was fear for himself. When he finished, he waited, as if expecting me to fold, to reassure him, to promise I would stop. I did none of those things. I told him calmly that I had every right to seek clarity about matters that affected my life. I told him I had documentation. I told him I was no longer willing to be kept in the dark for the sake of family harmony. He scoffed, a sound that carried more nerves than contempt. He accused me of being dramatic. He said I was imagining intent where there had only been necessity. I met his gaze and said something that finally broke through his composure. I said I was no longer interested in interpretations, only records. The color drained from his face. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and exposed. Finally, he straightened, his voice clipped now, the pretense of warmth gone. He told me I was forcing people into corners. He warned me again about consequences. Then he turned and walked out. I stood there for a moment after he left, feeling the residual tension in my chest begin to ease. The exchange had confirmed what I already knew. He was not trying to protect me. He was trying to protect himself. Upstairs, my phone buzzed with a new message from my mother. I did not open it. I already knew the pattern. Instead, I sat at my table and opened my laptop, adding notes about the encounter while it was still fresh. Dates, words used, reactions observed. I wrote not as someone venting, but as someone preparing. As the evening settled in, I felt a strange calm. The pieces were aligning, the pressure was increasing, and with every attempt to intimidate or guilt me into silence, my resolve grew steadier. I knew the next phase would not be quiet. I knew the stakes were rising, but I also knew something else now, with a certainty that did not waver. They could no longer pretend this was nothing, and neither could I. The shift did not announce itself with a single event, but with a steady accumulation of small ruptures that finally made denial impossible. I noticed it first in the way conversation stopped when I entered a room, then resumed with careful neutrality. I noticed it in the sudden politeness of relatives who had once spoken freely around me. I noticed it in how often my phone rang from numbers I had never saved, then went quiet when I did not answer. The pressure was spreading outward, and with it came stories. They arrived piecemeal, carried by people who framed them as concern or curiosity. Someone told me they had heard I was being influenced by outsiders. Someone else said it sounded like I was confused about paperwork and timing. A third suggested that everyone was under stress and that I should consider how fragile my mother had been lately. I listened. I said very little. Each version contradicted the last, and together they formed a picture that was clearer than any single truth. They were testing narratives, seeing which one might stick, which one I would react to, which one might make me step back. None did. The woman who had first warned me about escalation reached out again, this time with more urgency. She said the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. She said conversations were happening without me, fast and defensive. She said my uncle was trying to control the flow of information and failing. She did not sound pleased about that. She sounded worried. She told me something else then, something she had hesitated to share before. She said that years ago, she had asked a simple question at a family gathering, one that should have had an easy answer. She asked why certain plans had changed so abruptly, why resources that were once discussed openly had suddenly become unavailable. She said the response she received had been sharp, disproportionate, as if she had touched something raw. At the time, she let it go. She told herself she had misunderstood. She told herself it was not her place. Listening to her now, I felt a familiar ache, the kind that comes from recognizing how often silence masquerades as peace. How many people carry doubts quietly because speaking them would make life uncomfortable? That evening, I received a message from my mother that was different from the others. It was longer, more carefully composed. She wrote about love and intention, about how humor can sometimes be misjudged. She said she was worried about the path I was on and asked if we could meet, just the two of us, to talk things through like adults. The phrasing struck me. Like adults. As if adulthood were something she could grant or withhold based on my compliance. I did not respond. Instead, I thought about how quickly the conversation had moved from the cake to my behavior, from their actions to my reactions. The pattern was familiar. If I accepted the premise that my feelings were the problem, then the original harm could remain unexamined. I was done accepting that premise. The next day, the first real fracture appeared. It came not from my immediate family, but from someone adjacent. A person who had always been close enough to observe, but distant enough to avoid consequence. She reached out quietly, asking if we could talk. Her message was short, tentative, the digital equivalent of a knock on the door rather than a demand. We met for coffee in a small place near her office, the kind of spot where people spoke softly and kept their business to themselves. She looked tired, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug, eyes flicking toward the window as if expecting someone to walk in behind me. She told me she had been thinking about my situation and that it had stirred memories she had tried to ignore. She spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. She said there had been conversations years ago, things said in passing that did not make sense then but did now. She said she had always assumed I knew, that someone had explained things to me at some point. When I told her no, that no one had ever told me anything, her face changed. The color drained, replaced by a look that was equal parts guilt and alarm. She said she was sorry. Not for the cake, not for the jokes, for assuming someone else had done the right thing. She did not offer details, but she did confirm something important. She said that what I had uncovered was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision. A series of decisions, repeated and reinforced over time. She said people had convinced themselves it was justified, that circumstances demanded it, that I would understand eventually. Eventually had stretched into years. When we parted, she hugged me briefly, awkwardly, then walked away quickly, as if afraid to linger. I sat there for a moment after she left, staring at the empty chair across from me, feeling the weight of what had just been confirmed. The fracture widened. Within days, the tone of the messages shifted again. The guilt gave way to defensiveness. The concern sharpened into accusation. My uncle accused me of tearing the family apart. He said I was digging up the past and calling it justice. He said I was obsessed with proving something that did not matter anymore. My mother alternated between pleading and outrage. One message painted me as her wounded child who had misunderstood a joke. The next painted me as a calculating adult bent on revenge. The contradictions no longer bothered me. They told me exactly how disoriented they were. At work, I found myself unusually calm. I handled tasks efficiently, spoke up when I needed to, declined requests that did not serve me. My coworkers noticed. One commented that I seemed more grounded lately. I smiled and said I had been doing some thinking. At night, I organized my notes, cross-referencing dates and names, building a timeline that no one could talk their way around. The process was methodical, almost soothing. Each piece found its place. Each gap became more obvious. One evening, as I was sorting through documents, my phone rang again. It was my mother. I let it ring. When the voicemail notification appeared, I listened, not because I expected honesty, but because I wanted to hear the tone. She sounded frantic now, her words tumbling over each other. She said she was scared. She said she did not recognize me anymore. She said she did not understand why I was doing this. She said something else then, almost as an afterthought. She said people were asking questions. That was the first time she admitted it. Questions meant the narrative was slipping. Questions meant control was weakening. Questions meant the story could no longer be contained within the family. The realization did not make me gloat. It made me sad. I had spent so long wanting my family to see me clearly, to understand my worth without qualifiers. Now that clarity was arriving, but it was arriving through pressure, not compassion. I wondered briefly what it would have been like if the cake had never appeared, if I had continued to swallow small humiliations in exchange for proximity. How much longer the truth would have remained buried. The thought passed quickly. There was no going back to that version of myself. A few days later, my uncle attempted one last maneuver. He sent a message proposing a mediated conversation, someone neutral, someone trusted by the family. The offer might have sounded reasonable if it had come earlier, before threats and warnings, before the scramble to regain control. Now it felt like a delay tactic. I declined, politely and briefly, stating that any further communication should be documented. The response was immediate and furious. He accused me of being cold, of turning a family matter into a transaction. I did not reply. That night, I sat on my couch and watched the city lights flicker through my window. The noise of traffic hummed below, steady and indifferent. I thought about how many times I had mistaken endurance for strength, how often I had believed that tolerating harm made me mature, reasonable, good. I understood now that endurance without boundaries only teaches others how much you will accept. The next morning, I received confirmation that changed everything. A message from the woman who had first warned me, short and direct. She said the situation had reached a point where formal steps were being discussed. She said documents were being reviewed. She said the fear I had sensed was no longer hypothetical. She asked me if I was prepared for what came next. I stared at the message for a long moment before responding. Prepared was a strange word. It implied readiness, certainty, control. I did not feel any of those things. What I felt was resolve. I replied that I was not rushing, but I was not retreating either. When I set the phone down, I felt a calm settle over me that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with acceptance. The story had moved beyond private reckoning. It was entering a phase where actions would be weighed against records, not explanations. I knew there would be fallout. I knew relationships would fracture further. I knew I would be painted as the villain in some versions of this story. But I also knew something else. Something I had not known before. I was no longer carrying this alone. As the day unfolded, messages continued to arrive, but their urgency had changed. The frantic edge had dulled, replaced by caution. The threats softened into warnings, the pleas into silence. They were bracing now, not attacking. That night I slept deeply, not because I felt safe, but because I felt aligned. Whatever came next would be difficult, but it would be grounded in truth rather than performance. When I woke, I understood that the next step would not be mine alone to take, and that the quiet I had cultivated was about to give way to something far more public. I made coffee, stood by the window, and watched the morning settle into place, aware that the pause I was standing in would not last much longer, and that when it ended, nothing would return to the way it had been. The paperwork arrived in stages, not all at once, like weather rolling in from different directions. First came the confirmation that records had been requested, then notices that certain timelines were being reviewed. Each update was brief, factual, and stripped of emotion, which only made the impact sharper. There was no room in those messages for explanations or intentions, only actions and dates. I kept moving through my days with a steady routine, not because I felt untouched by what was happening, but because routine gave my body something familiar to hold on to. I woke at the same time. I made the same coffee. I went to work and did my job. In between, my phone buzzed with updates that slowly shifted the center of gravity away from my family's version of events. They felt it too. The first sign came from my mother. Her messages changed tone again, losing their earlier volatility and settling into something brittle. She wrote less often but said more when she did. Her words were careful, as if she were measuring each sentence against something unseen. She spoke about misunderstanding and regret, about how hard it was to live with things left unsaid. She still did not say sorry. My uncle went quiet for a stretch, which was more telling than anything he could have written. When he resurfaced, it was with formal language and an insistence on privacy. He warned me again about making things public. He suggested that once certain lines were crossed, they could not be uncrossed. I read his message twice and noticed how often he spoke about damage, but never about harm. At work, a colleague asked if everything was okay. I told her I was dealing with some family issues. She nodded with a sympathetic smile and said families can be complicated. I agreed. The understatement felt almost comforting. That evening, the woman who had been quietly supporting me reached out with a more detailed update. She explained that once records were requested, certain obligations kicked in automatically, that there were protocols that did not bend for family dynamics, that attempts to delay or obscure information often backfired. She asked if I had anyone with me when the next communication arrived. I told her I was fine on my own, and I meant it. The next communication did not come from my family. It came in the form of an envelope in my mailbox, thin and official, the kind that looks unremarkable until you hold it in your hands. I stood in the hallway of my building for a moment, the envelope resting against my palm, feeling the weight of it settle. Inside was a notice that formal review had begun. There was no drama in the language, no accusations, just confirmation that matters tied to my name were now being examined in a context that did not care about intent or family history. It felt strange to read something so neutral about something that had shaped my life for years. I brought the envelope upstairs and set it on my kitchen table, then sat across from it as if it were another person. My heart beat steadily, not racing, not slow, just present. I thought about the dinner again, about how public humiliation had been used as entertainment. I thought about how small I had been expected to feel. The contrast between that moment and this one was stark. Then, my worth had been measured in laughter. Now, it was being measured in records. The phone rang less after that. When it did ring, the calls were tentative. A relative I barely spoke to left a message asking if we could talk sometime. Another sent a text saying she hoped I was okay and that she had always admired my resilience. I recognized the shift immediately. People were adjusting their positions, preparing for outcomes they could no longer predict. One afternoon, my mother showed up at my door without warning. I saw her through the peephole first, standing too close, her posture stiff. For a moment, I considered not answering. I was not obligated to. But something in me wanted to see her face without the buffer of text or voicemail. I opened the door and did not step aside. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but energetically, as if the certainty she carried so easily had been worn down. Her eyes flicked past me into the apartment, taking inventory. Old habit. She said my name and stopped. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unyielding. Finally, she asked if we could talk. I told her we could talk there. She took a breath and began to speak, her words spilling out quickly at first, then slowing as she realized I was not interrupting. She spoke about fear, about sleepless nights, about not recognizing the situation anymore. She said she felt like things were spiraling beyond her control. Control. The word hung in the air. She said she never meant to hurt me. She said the dinner had been meant as a joke. She said humor sometimes goes wrong. She said people were under stress and that mistakes happen. I listened, my expression neutral, my hands resting loosely at my sides. When she paused, waiting for a response, I asked her a single question. I asked her why. If it was a joke, she had never apologized. Her face tightened. She looked away for a moment, then back at me. She said apologies imply wrongdoing. She said she did not believe she had done anything wrong, only misunderstood. I nodded slowly. That answer clarified more than any argument could have. I told her that records were being reviewed. I told her that I would not interfere with the process. I told her that whatever happened next would be based on facts, not explanations. She reacted the way people do when they realize a conversation has moved beyond their influence. Her voice rose slightly. She accused me of punishing her. She said I was cold. She said family does not do this to each other. I did not raise my voice. I told her that family also does not humiliate one of its own for entertainment. That family does not make decisions about someone's life without their knowledge. That family does not demand silence as proof of loyalty. She stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. The version of me she had relied on was gone, and she did not know how to speak to the person standing in front of her. She left without another word. After the door closed, I leaned against it for a moment, my breath steady, my legs solid beneath me. There was sadness there, but it was clean, not tangled in guilt or doubt. I had spoken plainly. I had not performed or pleaded. That night, I slept deeply. The days that followed were marked by a strange calm. Updates continued to arrive, each one narrowing the space for interpretation. Dates were confirmed. Names matched. Patterns held. What had once been easy to dismiss as misunderstanding was now documented. My uncle attempted one last outreach, sending a message that framed the situation as an overreaction driven by hurt feelings. He urged me to reconsider before permanent damage was done. I did not respond. The woman who had guided me through this stage called to check in. She said the review was proceeding as expected. She said the consistency of the records mattered. She said patience was working in my favor. She also said something else. She said families often believe their internal rules override external ones, until they do not. That realization tends to be abrupt. I thanked her and hung up, sitting quietly for a moment afterward. The apartment felt calm, almost serene. Outside, traffic moved in steady streams, people going about their lives unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding in mine. I thought about how much energy I had spent trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. How many times I had been told to let things go, to be the bigger person, to keep the peace. Peace, I realized, had always meant silence. That silence was gone now, replaced by something more durable. As evening settled in, I received a final message for the day, brief and restrained. It confirmed the next phase of the process. It did not ask for input. It did not invite discussion. It simply stated what would happen next. I set the phone down and walked to the window, watching the lights come on one by one in the buildings across the street. Somewhere below, someone laughed. Somewhere else, a door slammed. Life continued, indifferent and relentless. I felt no triumph, no desire for revenge. What I felt was a quiet sense of alignment, as if my actions finally matched what I had known to be true all along. Whatever came next would not be comfortable. It would not be easy, but it would be honest. And for the first time, that felt like enough. I stood there for a long moment, letting the pause settle, knowing that the next step would not belong to me alone, and that when it arrived, it would change the shape of everything that followed. The hearing was scheduled on a weekday morning that felt deliberately ordinary, as if the world wanted to remind me that this was not a spectacle, but a process. I woke before my alarm, the room still dark, and lay there for a moment listening to the building settle around me. My heart was steady. That surprised me. I dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, but to feel anchored in my own body. Comfortable shoes, a simple jacket. Nothing that made me feel like I was playing a role. When I stepped outside, the air was cool and clear, the kind that sharpens your senses without overwhelming them. The building itself was unremarkable, all straight lines and neutral colors, designed to be efficient rather than intimidating. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued. People spoke quietly. Shoes echoed softly against polished floors. I checked in, followed directions, and took a seat on a hard bench that seemed designed to discourage lingering. As I waited, I noticed my uncle across the room. He sat rigidly, his posture too controlled, his hands folded in his lap. He did not look at me at first. When he finally did, his gaze slid away quickly, as if eye contact carried risk. My mother arrived a few minutes later, her movements sharp, her expression carefully composed. She glanced at me once, then turned her attention to the person beside her, as if I were no longer part of the equation. Seeing them there stirred something in me, but it was not the anger I might have expected. It was a strange clarity. Removed from the familiar settings where they usually held authority, they looked smaller, constrained by rules they did not control. When my name was called, I stood and walked forward, my steps measured. The room we entered was plain, almost austere. A long table, a few chairs, papers stacked neatly. This was not a place for storytelling or emotional appeals. It was a place for records. The process unfolded methodically. Documents were presented. Timelines were reviewed. Questions were asked and answered in careful, precise language. I spoke only when necessary, my voice steady, my words deliberate. I did not explain how things had felt. I did not describe the dinner or the laughter or the cake. Those details, so vivid in my memory, had no weight here. What mattered were names, dates, signatures, and actions. As the discussion continued, I watched my mother's composure crack in small ways, a tightening around her mouth, a quick shake of the head. She tried to interject once, framing a decision as necessity rather than choice. The response she received was calm but firm, redirecting the focus back to the records. Intentions were noted but did not override documentation. My uncle spoke less. When he did, his words were clipped, defensive. He leaned heavily on explanations that might have carried weight in a family setting but sounded hollow here. Circumstances, pressure, assumptions. None of it changed what was written. At one point, a document was referenced that I had not seen before, something uncovered through the review process. The effect was immediate. My uncle stiffened. My mother's face drained of color. The room felt charged, the air suddenly heavier. I did not react outwardly. Inside, something settled. This was the confirmation I had sensed, but could never prove on my own. The pattern extended further than I had known. The hearing ended without drama. No raised voices, no declarations. Just a clear outline of next steps and consequences, delivered in the same neutral tone with which everything else had been handled. I was told what would happen and when. There was no invitation to negotiate. When it was over, I gathered my things and stood. My mother looked at me then, really looked, as if searching for something. I did not know what she expected to find. I met her gaze briefly, then turned and walked out. Outside, the light felt brighter, the air sharper. I stood on the steps for a moment, letting my breath even out. My phone buzzed with messages I did not read. I knew their content without opening them. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden apologies. Instead, there was a slow recalibration. My mother's messages became infrequent, careful. My uncle went silent again, his presence reduced to occasional formal notices. Word traveled, as it always does, Relatives reached out with tentative congratulations, thinly veiled curiosity, awkward offers of support. Some kept their distance, unsure of how to align themselves now that the ground had shifted. I did not chase any of them. I did not need to. At work, I felt lighter, more present. Tasks that once felt burdensome now seemed manageable. When challenges arose, I met them without the familiar undercurrent of self-doubt. I realized how much of my energy had been spent bracing for judgment, how freeing it was to stop doing that. One evening, I received a letter from my mother. The handwriting was careful, the paper thick. I opened it slowly, sitting at my kitchen table. She wrote about regret and confusion, about not recognizing how things had gone so wrong. She spoke of love, of wanting to move forward. The letter skirted the edges of accountability without stepping fully into it. There was sorrow, but it was inward-facing, focused on her own distress rather than the harm caused. I read it once, then folded it and set it aside. I did not feel compelled to respond. The woman who had guided me through the process called later that week. She said the outcome was proceeding as expected. She said the documentation had spoken clearly. She asked how I was holding up. I told her I was tired, but okay. More than okay. I felt grounded. She said something then that stayed with me. She said that when people lose control over a narrative they have shaped for years, the aftermath can be messy. That it is not my job to manage their discomfort. I thanked her and hung up, sitting quietly for a while afterward. As the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects became more visible. My mother downsized her social circle, retreating from gatherings where questions might be asked. My uncle's influence waned, his authority undermined by scrutiny he could not deflect. I watched all of this from a distance, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Engaging too closely would have pulled me back into patterns I had worked hard to break. One afternoon, I found myself back in the neighborhood where the diner stood. I did not plan it. I had taken a wrong turn and ended up on that familiar street. The sign was still there, neon humming softly. Through the window, I could see a family laughing in a booth, a cake on the table. I did not feel the urge to go in. I did not feel anger or bitterness. I felt a quiet recognition of how easily moments like that can be weaponized, how thin the line is between celebration and cruelty. I drove on. That night, I sat on my couch with a cup of tea, the city lights flickering outside. I thought about how much had changed in such a short time, how standing up once, calmly and without spectacle, had set so many things in motion. I understood now that the hearing had not been the climax. It had been a turning point, a moment where the balance shifted irreversibly. What came next would be about living with the consequences, for all of us. As I finished my tea, my phone buzzed with a notification confirming the next formal update. I read it, nodded to myself, and set the phone down. I did not know exactly what the final resolution would look like, but I knew this much. I would not be shrinking myself to make it easier for anyone else to avoid accountability. That chapter of my life was closed, and whatever followed would be written on terms I had chosen, not ones handed to me in frosting and laughter. The weeks after the hearing settled into my life like a new season, not announced by a single dramatic change, but by the quiet rearrangement of everyday things. Mornings felt steadier. I slept through the night more often than not. When I woke, I did not immediately brace myself for a message or a confrontation. The tension that had lived just under my skin for years began to loosen, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. My phone stayed mostly quiet. When it did light up, it was usually with neutral updates or brief check-ins from people who had supported me without asking for anything in return. My mother did not call. My uncle did not write. Their absence felt deliberate, like a strategic retreat, and I let it remain that way. I started noticing how much space their silence created. Without the constant pull of family expectations, my days opened up in unexpected ways. I lingered over coffee in the mornings. I took walks in the evenings without replaying conversations in my head. I caught myself humming while doing dishes, a small, ordinary sign of ease that felt almost foreign. At work, I was asked to take on a role that would have terrified me a year earlier. It involved visibility, decision-making, the kind of responsibility that once triggered a familiar chorus of self-doubt. This time, I listened to the proposal carefully and said yes, without apologizing for needing time or reassurance. The confidence surprised my colleagues and, if I was honest, surprised me too. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I ran into an older coworker who had always struck me as grounded, someone who had weathered her own storms quietly. She asked how I was doing, really doing, and I told her the truth, that things were complicated but clearer, that I felt lighter. She nodded and said something that stayed with me. She said clarity often feels like loss at first, because it forces you to give up the hope that things will magically become what you needed them to be. But once that hope is gone, you can finally build something real. That evening, I sat with that thought as I cooked dinner, chopping vegetables slowly, deliberately. The rhythm of it felt meditative. I realized how long I had been holding on to the idea that one day my family would see me differently, that they would recognize my worth without qualifiers or jokes. Letting go of that hope was painful, but it was also freeing. A few days later, I received another letter from my mother. This one was shorter. The tone was subdued, almost cautious. She wrote that she was trying to understand how things had reached this point. She said she missed me. She asked if there might be a way to talk soon. I read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it back in the envelope. I did not feel anger. I did not feel guilt. What I felt was a clear boundary settling into place. Missing someone does not undo harm. Wanting to talk does not automatically earn access. I put the letter away and went for a walk. As autumn deepened, the city changed around me. Leaves gathered along the sidewalks. The air turned crisp. People bundled up in scarves and jackets. I found comfort in the predictability of the season, in the way change could be both visible and manageable. One Saturday morning, I met the woman who had first warned me about escalation for breakfast. We chose a quiet place with simple food and no rush. She looked relieved when she saw me, her shoulders relaxing as we hugged. Over coffee, she told me how the situation looked from her side now. The family dynamics had shifted in ways that were still settling. Some people were angry, some were embarrassed, some were quietly reassessing their own choices. She said my mother had withdrawn from certain circles, preferring smaller gatherings where questions would not be asked. She said my uncle's influence had diminished, his authority no longer unquestioned. I listened without satisfaction or regret. These were consequences, not victories. She asked me how I was feeling about everything. I took a moment to answer honestly. I told her that some days were still heavy, that grief came in waves, unexpected and sharp. I told her that other days felt peaceful in a way I had not known before. I said I was learning to trust that peace. She smiled and said that sounded like healing, even if it did not always feel like it. Later that week, my cousin called, the one who had spoken to me honestly early on. She wanted to check in, to see how I was holding up. We talked about ordinary things for a while, work and weather and small annoyances, before the conversation naturally drifted back to family. She admitted that the past months had forced her to look at things she had ignored, patterns she had accepted as normal. She said watching me refuse to back down had been uncomfortable, but also clarifying. It had given her permission to question things in her own life. Hearing that stirred something warm and bittersweet in me. Change rarely happens in isolation. It ripples outward, touching places you cannot predict. As winter approached, I made small changes to my space. I rearranged furniture. I cleared out boxes I had been dragging from apartment to apartment for years. I hung a new piece of art on the wall, something simple and calming. Each adjustment felt like a quiet declaration that this life, this space, was mine. One evening, as I was sorting through old papers, I came across a birthday card from years ago. My mother's handwriting was cheerful, affectionate. I sat with it for a moment, feeling the familiar ache of contradiction. Love and harm intertwined so tightly they were hard to separate. I did not tear the card up. I did not keep it either. I placed it in a box of things I was not ready to decide about yet and moved on. The final update arrived on a gray afternoon, understated and definitive. The process had concluded. The outcomes were outlined clearly. There was nothing left to contest, nothing left to reinterpret. I read the message carefully, then closed my phone and sat quietly for a long time. I expected to feel triumph. I expected to feel vindicated. What I felt instead was a deep, steady calm. The matter was resolved, at least on paper. The larger work, I knew, would continue in less visible ways. Trust does not regenerate on command. Distance does not erase history. But clarity had done what it needed to do. It had drawn a line that would not move. That night, I cooked myself a simple meal and ate at the table, candles lit, music playing softly. It was not a celebration. It was an acknowledgement of endurance, of growth, of the courage it takes to stop accepting what hurts you. Before bed, I wrote in my journal, something I had returned to after years of neglect. I wrote about what I had learned, not in grand declarations, but in small truths. That love without respect is not enough. That silence can be a form of self-betrayal. That dignity is not something you earn by enduring cruelty. As I closed the journal, I thought about the younger version of myself who had sat in that diner, staring at a cake and wondering if she deserved better. I wished I could tell her that she did, that she always had. The house was quiet as I turned off the lights. Outside, a light rain had begun to fall, soft and steady. I listened to it for a moment, feeling a sense of completion settle in my chest. There was still one chapter left to write. I knew that. Not about hearings or documents or family fallout, but about what comes after. About building a life that does not revolve around proving your worth to people who refuse to see it. I lay down and closed my eyes, letting that thought carry me into sleep, aware that the story was not over yet, but confident that whatever ending I chose next would finally belong to me. Life did not magically become easy after everything ended. I want to be honest about that. There was no sudden transformation where every bill disappeared and my heart felt light all the time. Real life does not work that way. What changed was something deeper and quieter. The constant pressure lifted. The feeling that I was always one wrong move away from being labeled the problem began to fade. It started with my mornings. For years, I woke up tense without knowing why. I would open my eyes and feel my shoulders tight, my jaw clenched, my thoughts already racing. I thought it was stress, work, adulthood, the normal weight of being in your late 20s and trying to build a life. It was not just that. It was the background fear that my family would reach in at any moment and remind me who they believed I was. After the last phase ended, that fear loosened. Some mornings I woke up and realized I had not thought about them at all. Not even once. No dread. No anticipation. No rehearsed conversations. Just quiet. My mother tried to re-enter my life in a careful way. It was a message at first, then a letter, then another message. She talked about wanting to move forward. She said she missed me. She said she hoped we could start fresh. The words sounded reasonable on the surface, They always do when someone is trying to regain access. What she never did was address the core truth. She never owned the cruelty. She never acknowledged how deliberate it had been. She never said she was sorry for choosing to turn my birthday into public humiliation. Instead, she leaned on softness, on time, on the idea that family should stay connected no matter what. I used to believe that. I used to confuse loyalty with love. I used to think keeping the peace made me a good person. Now I understood something else. Peace that requires you to accept disrespect is not peace. It is control. So I kept my boundary. I responded with basic civility when necessary and nothing more. I did not argue. I did not negotiate. I did not explain my pain to someone who had laughed at it. I realized something in that process. The hardest part of stepping away is accepting that the person who hurt you may never understand why. They may never agree. They may never offer the apology you deserve. And you still have to choose yourself anyway. My uncle vanished. I heard his name now and then through distant relatives. They said he was furious, that he felt attacked, that he believed he had done nothing wrong. His certainty did not interest me. It was the same certainty that allowed him to treat other people's futures like tools to be managed. I stopped looking for closure from him. The closure I needed came from my own decision not to return to that dynamic. I started building my life with small, intentional choices. I applied for a better position at work and accepted it without minimizing my accomplishment. I organized my finances with a seriousness I had not had before, not because I suddenly became perfect, but because I wanted to feel safe. I made my home calmer. I removed things that reminded me of old stress. I brought in plants and soft light, small signals to my nervous system that I was not in survival mode anymore. I also began to notice how my relationships changed. I became less tolerant of people who made jokes at someone else's expense. I started paying attention to how I felt after conversations, whether I felt energized or drained. I chose friendships that felt mutual. There was one moment that stays with me. I was at a small gathering, and someone made a snide comment about another woman's life choices, then waited for everyone to laugh. The room went quiet for a beat, and I saw the familiar pattern forming, the pressure to join in so no one would feel awkward. I did not laugh. I simply looked at her and said that sounded unnecessary. The moment passed quickly, but something inside me shifted. I realized I had learned to protect myself by becoming someone who would not participate in humiliation, not even casually. Months later, I drove past the diner again. It was early evening, neon glowing, people inside eating and talking. For a second, my body tightened, the memory automatic. Then it relaxed. That place was no longer a trap in my mind. It was a reminder of a decision. The moment I stood up, took my bag, and left calmly was the moment I stopped letting their laughter define reality. On my next birthday, I kept things small. I spent the day the way I wanted. I took myself out for lunch. I walked by the water. I bought a slice of cake from a bakery and ate it at home with tea. The simplest kind of celebration. It mattered more than any big dinner ever could, because it was mine. Sometimes I think people expect a story like this to end with fireworks, with someone getting what they deserve in a way that feels dramatic. That is not how my ending felt. My ending felt like breathing normally. It felt like coming home to a quiet apartment and feeling safe instead of lonely. It felt like not checking my phone with dread. It felt like making plans without needing permission. It felt like dignity. If you are listening and any part of this story feels familiar, I want you to remember something. The moment you set a boundary, people who benefited from your silence will call you selfish. They will call you difficult. They will call you ungrateful. That does not mean your boundary is wrong. It means it is working. You do not have to keep laughing at jokes that hurt you. You do not have to keep showing up to spaces where you are treated like a punchline. You do not have to keep carrying the emotional labor of making everyone else comfortable. And if this story hit home for you, I would love for you to share your thoughts. What would you have done in that diner? What was your turning point? If you have one, or if you are still building the courage for it, you are welcome here. Subscribe and stay with me, because there are more stories ahead, more moments where the tables turn quietly, more reminders that justice does not always roar. Sometimes it simply stands up, picks up its bag, and walks out.